Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We have an extraordinary program for you tonight. A real Russian extravaganza, but written by two of the most different composers from any country you could imagine. Rachmaninoff and Stravinsky, writing basically in the same 18 months in the years 1912, 1913. Just before the beginning of the First World War, and maybe almost more importantly for Rachmaninoff, before the Russian Revolution. Now, The Bells is still far too little known, but for many people it's Rachmaninoff's masterpiece. And it has a funny story to do with it. Rachmaninoff had written an early cantata called Spring at the beginning of the 20th century. And he had wanted to find something to follow it up with. He'd wanted to write a big choral piece. He couldn't find a text until a few years later, sitting in the hotel at the desk at which Tchaikovsky had also written music in Rome. He received an anonymous letter giving him what he thought was a poem by Balmont, the Russian poet, called The Bells. In fact, The Bells was written by Edgar Allan Poe, and Balmont had translated it. The young lady who sent it to Rachmaninoff only revealed who she was, and that at that time a young cello student. She revealed who she was after Rachmaninoff's death. But the words sent him into a frenzy, and he wrote later that every Russian lives within the sound of bells. We're born to bells, we die with bells. And the bells of Moscow particularly had haunted him all his life. And he was not only writing just about bells, this is not just picturesque music. He was writing about the journey from life to death. The four movements are like a symphony. He even called it his third symphony. Based somehow on Tchaikovsky's Pathetique Symphony, the same type of shape, with a scherzo as the third movement and a very profound, slow last movement. And they bring you from the sleigh bells of the first to the wedding bells of the second, the alarm bells, war, terror of the third, and the deep bells of death at the end. Astonishing piece, wonderfully orchestrated, but also with this typical bittersweetness that you have with a composer like Rachmaninoff. When he talks about sleigh bells and joy and beauty, he also talks about oblivion. And typically, when he talks about death, there's also some kind of consolation in death. I hope you enjoy this. We have loved working on it, Rachmaninoff's The Bells.
Hello, I'm Simon Halsey. I'm Chief Conductor of the Berlin Radio Choir, and my job in this concert is to train the choir that's going to sing with Simon Rattle and the Berliner Philharmoniker. We're singing two pieces in this concert, Glocken, or The Bells, by Rachmaninoff, and The King of the Stars by Stravinsky, and they're radically different pieces. Let's take the Stravinsky to start off with. It's just 4.5 minutes long, and it's only for the men's choir. And you would think, 4.5 minutes of music that's 100 years old, this can't be much of a problem. But it's one of the most difficult pieces that I ever have to train a choir for. For a start, it's for men's voices only, and in many choirs, not in this one, but in many choirs, the tenors and basses are comparatively weak compared to the women. In this choir, our men are absolutely magnificent, but they sing in 4 parts. The tenor part is very high, the lowest bass part is very low, and the notes are extraordinarily difficult. So to learn this piece, first of all, we start with each individual line, and then pairs of lines, and then 3 lines, and then 4 lines. Very often the music works in a sort of harmonic way with three parts, and then the fourth part is extremely dissonant. And if we're going to hold the pitches and arrive at the end of a long phrase exactly in tune, then everyone has to know exactly how their note fits into every chord, and we have to blend and balance them and listen and listen and listen. Also, the piece is in Russian, and the Russian goes by quite quickly, so we spend a great deal of time with a language coach, working just at the rhythm of the language, speaking it and speaking it and speaking it, really until we know it more or less off by heart. Then within these 4 minutes, the text, there are 5 verses of a poem, so there's a great deal of it, and it goes from triple piano to fortissimo and tells a big story, so we always have to be right on top of the idea of telling the story. The other thing is that most of the time the orchestra doesn't help us. They're playing discords and they don't help us to find our note. And one of the most dangerous things for most choirs, but I'm very glad to say not for this choir, is at the beginning they begin without a note. They simply begin on a C major and a C minor chord at the same time and yell the name of the piece at the top of their voices from apparently nowhere, so that all of them have to work out the first note from the orchestra tuning just before they sing. Now, this piece is a religious Russian piece, Russian Orthodox music, and in it there is an element of church music and bells, and that's the connection to Die Glocken, to the bells of Rachmaninoff. It's interesting. The Bells of Rachmaninoff is a repertoire piece in some countries. It's done quite a lot in Russia, in Great Britain, in America, but not so often here in Germany. In fact, I believe it's the first time the Berliner Philharmoniker ever played it, and it's certainly the first time that the Rundfunkchor ever sang it. But it's a masterpiece. It's a little symphony in 4 movements, and the choir plays an extremely important part in it. We tell the story. There are 4 movements. Each one is about the different times in life when bells are really important. So christenings, weddings, death, and so on. And again, the text is so important. So we sing in Russian, and we do a great deal of work, as I've already said, with our language coach. And one of the interesting things is how energetic the text has to be behind the orchestra, because as you'll see, the orchestra is enormous. We've got a very big choir, but the size, the resonance of the orchestration is extraordinary. It's one of the loudest pieces I know. And in the rehearsal time, Simon Rattle has been extraordinarily careful to balance things, to tell people that forte really isn't very loud. And I've had to mark up quite a lot of things in the choir, from pianissimo, for example, which is a wonderful idea and a colour, perhaps to something like mezzo piano or mezzo forte. And a lot of the piece we've learnt off by heart, so that we can really direct it to you and to the public across the orchestra to have a real chance of competing. So this piece is comparatively straightforward from our point of view for the notes, but the expression, the sort of operatic putting over of the piece, is in a way the complete opposite of the Stravinsky. So here we have a concert that is a marvellous combination of styles, of music written at about the same time, where 2 Russian composers are apparently writing in a completely different language from each other. I hope you find it as fascinating as we do.
2 masterpieces by Stravinsky, Le Roi des Étoiles, the King of the Stars, and Le Sacre de Printemps, The Rite of Spring. The Rite of Spring, one of the works that changed the world, one of the most revolutionary pieces ever written. A piece that Stravinsky, even himself, couldn't believe he'd written. He said it started off with a dream. He dreamt of a girl dancing herself to death. And he then said that he felt somehow that the Rite of Spring had come from outside him. He used to say, "I'm the vessel through which Le Sacre passed." And in fact, of course, it was never quite as simple as that with Stravinsky, because he had taken an enormous number of old Russian folk tunes, and he had remembered the village musicians for where he had grown up and lived. And he took these things and he deconstructed them. He tore them up rather like a cubist painting. But there is absolutely no doubt that nothing like this had ever been heard before. Of course, the first performance in May 1913 was a famous riot. People who were there remember that the very beginning of the piece, with its high bassoon, making the sound of the earth cracking, that was heard with some kind of respectful silence. But the minute the famous dissonant, violent stamping chords began, people began to object louder and louder. And it was very clear that, as Stravinsky said, no one could hear the music at all. He could hear Nijinsky behind the stage screaming out numbers so that the dancers didn't get lost. But when it came to it, there was still a great success. This is what people forget, is the people who loved it, and it was like a class war going on between the rich in the stalls and the poor in the balcony. The balconies gave it an enormous ovation, and apparently by the second performance, the riot had stopped, and people were realizing that there was one of the great masterpieces in front of them. And of course, in retrospect, people felt that it could feel the First World War coming. It wasn't only spring in Russia that was cracking open the world. The whole of Europe was about to enter a conflagration like it had never known. The piece is in two parts, about 15 minutes each. In fact, it's a relatively short piece. It doesn't feel like a short piece because you have gone through so many things. Every year, the old Russian tribe, select somebody to be the sacrificial victim. And you hear everything in the piece, from spring coming, even my favorite moment, which Stravinsky, near the end of the first part, where Stravinsky said, "Oh, this is meant to sound like the knees of the old man creaking as he goes down to kiss the earth." And the final last dance, which is of such a rhythmic complexity that at first Stravinsky had absolutely no idea how to write it down. In fact, there's wonderful photographs of his manuscript without any bar lines, just with all the chords and the rhythms, before he could work out where someone should put the beat. Still, almost 100 years since its first performance, the piece still thrills, the piece still shocks, and it's still like nothing else. Just before it, we play a very rarely played masterpiece. Words also by the Russian poet Balmont, the King of the Stars. This time really written by Balmont. There's a wonderful story concerning Rachmaninoff's bells, which at the end of Rachmaninoff's life, he asked the writer Nabokov if he could translate the Russian back to English for Rachmaninoff. He'd be interested to see how it was in English. And it occurred to Nabokov, who was too shy to ask, that he didn't realize that in fact the piece had been originally written in English by Edgar Allan Poe. Rachmaninoff had written this masterpiece without realizing this at all. However, The King of the Stars by Stravinsky, this really is by Balmont, and it's written for a male chorus and a gigantic orchestra, and it's less than 5 minutes long. It reminds me as though you've gone into a very dark Orthodox church, and suddenly all the icons have been lit up by some kind of supernatural light. It was a type of sound and a type of style that Stravinsky basically never returned to again, and it was deep embedded in his Russian Orthodox soul. But this kind of strange mysticism, which still lives on in Russia now, is absolutely encapsulated in the 5 minutes of this piece. It was dedicated to Debussy, who said, "I'm so grateful to see this. I can't ever imagine it being performed. Maybe on the star Aldebaran, but certainly not on this earth. It's too difficult to play." And in fact, it waited until the late 30s to be performed at all. Pierre Boulez and I talk about this piece. He said he always wished that Stravinsky had gone on writing like this, because there would have been another extraordinary stream of music of the 20th century. But both he and I, we laughed because we found, oh, we put it on as often as we can when it won't absolutely break the bank. And so, how perfect. 3 pieces in one evening, 2 of them talking about life to death, 1 of them talking about the creation of the world, full of this deep, dark Russian soul, and finishing with some of the most extraordinary and pitiless music in the whole classical canon, The Rite of Spring.